who is doing an outstanding work in this Parliament, and I thank him for his question, Mr. Speaker. And let me answer what is also behind this bill. What we want to do is increase public safety in this country, Mr. Speaker, and I've alluded to those measures we are putting in place, such as mandatory training and reducing domestic violence by removing the firearms license to people recognized guilty of an indictment. But, Mr. Speaker, it is now time that we treat hunters and farmers, sport shooters, and those who possess law-abiding citizens. It's time to treat them with respect and dignity, and it's also time to cut red tape. So what will we do? It will cut red tape, Mr. Speaker. We will simplify the procedure, and we won't turn them into criminal, Mr. Speaker, because a decision has been taken overnight, Mr. Speaker. There will be scrutiny. There will be measures, Mr. Speaker, to making sure that those people are treated as any other Canadian is treated in this country. Hear, hear.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Esquimalt, Juan de Fuca.
Well, thank you very much. And in a few minutes, we'll be given the opportunity to speak on the bill, and there are, of course, some good things there. But I'm concerned that the minister may inadvertently be misleading the House. He says they're not changing anything about the transportation regulations. So I wonder if the minister can tell us if he's talked to the member for Dauphin Swan River Marquette, who put notice today of a private member's bill that he intends to introduce, a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Criminal Code, Firearms, Storage and Transportation. So I'm very concerned about the content of this bill that we're going to see this week, and it'll be coming up in the next round of private members' bills. So the minister's just assured us they're not changing anything. Can he assure me that this private member's bill, that he's talked to this member, and that this will not be altering the transportation and storage regulations? Because he's a member of your caucus, and you said you've consulted the members of your caucus. So did you consult the member for Dauphin Swan River about this attempt to change those requirements?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Well, Mr. Speaker, one thing is certainly going to be sure at the end of this day is that this bill, C-44, the Common Sense Firearm Licensing Act, is keeping the same way to transport a restricted firearms as it is today. And this is the will of the government to continue that way, Mr. Speaker. But let me be very clear, Mr. Speaker. Once again, to carry a restricted firearms, it has to be unloaded, Mr. Speaker. It also has to be trigger lock or neutralized in any other way to do it technically. It has to be in a locker that is safe, in a box that is safe. And hopefully, if we are to travel with it, it has to be in the trunk of a car, and it also has to be with a valid owner of a restricted firearm licensing, Mr. Speaker. And this bill, frankly, is not addressing this. I invite the member, when there will be debate on other private members' bill, to raise this issue. As he knows, these are not the government's bill. What I hope is we're going to have a good discussion on this bill that is going to be being bring up on committee so that we can vote this bill for what it is. It is common sense firearm licensing act that is increasing the safety of this country and keeping law-abiding Canadian without redless paperwork. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Esquimalt, Juan de Fuca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak against Bill C-42, the so-called Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. While this is not the most egregious short title assigned by the Conservatives to a bill, even in this session, this bill might better be titled the Special Interest Firearms Licensing Act. What we have before us is a bill which only looks like common sense when viewed from the point of view of the gun lobby. You Democrats believe that public safety must always trump politics when it comes to firearms licensing and regulation. The Conservatives, on the other hand, have been promoting the dangerous ideas of the gun lobby, a small minority of Canadians, and perhaps even a small minority among gun owners. This is the idea that any regulations at all on firearms pit the interests of law-abiding gun owners against the government and the police, and that these regulations amount to nothing more than excessive red tape. You Democrats have a different view, one that clearly puts public safety first. The Conservatives like to pose as the only ones here who understand rural Canada. And let me say, perhaps to the shock and surprise of some, I actually grew up on a farm. My father and his father before him were hunters. Hunters of quail, pheasant, duck, deer, and moose, and all but one of these later graced our table when I was a kid. And I have to say, sometimes there wouldn't have been much on the table without the hunting that went on in my family. I myself learned to shoot at a young age, an age that most now might consider inappropriately young. And yes, my grandpa always kept a shotgun behind the door for scaring away the coyotes, and it must have worked because I never saw any. But this was in the day before those proper storage regulations. And when those came in, he changed his behavior. He did not see it as an unnecessary red tape. He saw it as good advice for keeping his family safe, and the shotgun disappeared from behind the door and into a locked cabinet. Subsequently, I lived in the Northwest Territories as a young adult. I was fresh out of university, and while I was there, I was privileged to go hunting and out on the trap lines with my Denny friends. Though I have to say, by that time, I was not so much a fan of doing the shooting myself. It was a great experience, a great life experience that I had there. None of them regarded safety regulations as red tape. And now I represent a riding that stretches from the Victoria Harbour all the way out to the head of the West Coast Trail at Port Renfrew. So I do know something about law-abiding gun owners, and I know something about communities where hunting is much more than just a prop to use in arguments about gun registration and licensing. When the Conservatives abolished the gun registry, we on this side of the House warned it would be necessary to remain vigilant on the question of gun licensing and gun regulations. We all knew that the gun lobby wouldn't be happy to stop at the abolition of the registry, that they would keep pushing from their US-influenced ideological viewpoint to weaken all the other measures in Canada which place restrictions on firearms in the interest of public safety. Like his gun lobby allies, the Minister of Public Safety has fallen into the habit of using US rhetoric in his comments on firearms. This was never clearer than on July 23, 2014, when the minister said, and I quote him, "To possess a firearm is a right, and it is a right that comes with responsibilities," end quote. So here we have a Minister of the Crown, one of the government's chief legal ministers, directly contradicting the Supreme Court of Canada. In 1993, the Supreme Court found in a case called Regina versus Hasselwander that, and let me quote the Supreme Court here, "Canadians, unlike Americans, do not have a constitutional right to bear arms. Yeah. Indeed, most Canadians prefer the peace of mind and sense of security derived from the knowledge that possession of automatic weapons is prohibited," end quote. So there's the minister in direct contradiction of the Supreme Court in the rhetoric that he's using around gun licensing. The court couldn't have been more clear, nor could there have been any doubt about the precedent, since the Hasselwander case was precisely about the right to possess automatic weapons. The court later reiterated this point, that in Canada there is no right to own firearms. This was in the 2010 case of Regina versus Montague. And in this case, the Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal against an Ontario Court of Appeal decision rejecting the existence of such a right in Canada. So like their gun lobby colleagues, when they're challenged on the rights question, Conservatives often switch gears and try to argue that gun ownership is somehow a property right. Another right, I would point out, that's not found in the Canadian Constitution. So what the minister's comments last July clearly indicate is that, unfortunately, we have a government who likes to pander to the gun lobby. At least in this case, though, I'd have to say they do so fairly transparently, and they do so in order to generate political support from their base. When the Conservatives made their first appointments to the Firearms Advisory Committee, the committee responsible for advising the minister on firearms regulations, the appointees were drawn entirely from representatives of the gun lobby. It took until 2012 for the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police to prevail on the government to add 3 police chiefs to the 9 gun advocates the government had already placed on the advisory committee.
What an unbalanced view.
And this came only after the committee came forward with a set of extreme recommendations for the government, which included such great ideas as extending ownership licenses to 10 years, and unbelievably a proposal that the police should resell guns which have been seized rather than destroying them, as is now the case. It's hard for me to even imagine the police running a kind of garage sale of seized weapons. This is the kind of recommendations that came from this firearms advisory committee, which was loaded with gun lobby advocates. So when it comes to the specific firearms regulations adopted by the Conservatives, the influence of the gun lobby is quite apparent. In 2011, the Department of Public Safety drafted new regulations for gun shows, that would have required things most Canadians would see as common sense. It would have required things like notifying the local police of gun shows to be held in their jurisdiction. That doesn't seem like red tape to me. That seems like common sense. And it would have required the tethering of guns on display at a gun show. Again, if you've ever gone to a cell phone kiosk, you find the cell phones tethered. Why not have this important public safety measure of tethering guns at a gun show? So these gun show regulations were to have been brought into force in 2012. But no, that didn't happen. Instead, the Conservatives junked the proposed regulations altogether after complaints from the gun lobby that these new requirements were too onerous. I guess we should have seen this coming because the Firearms Advisory Committee called for scrapping the gun show regulations in its March 2012 report. So I'm worried about who was consulted, as I said in my question to the minister at the beginning. Who did he talk to? He says he talked to the hunting lobbies. He said he talked to members of his caucus. He probably looked at the reports from the Firearms Advisory Committee. But we see that the slanted kind of approach that's taken there has had an influence on what the minister's already doing. Regulations were also due to come into force in December 2012 to require that each gun manufactured in Canada would have to have an individual serial number. Surprising to me that that's not a requirement, as it's actually something required by the international treaties to which Canada is already a party. And again, it's something that seems like common sense when it comes to the police being able to trace guns used in crimes or in the fight to combat the illegal international arms trade, or the international trade in small arms. In November of 2013, for a second time, the Conservatives quietly implemented a regulation delaying the coming into force of this requirement for serial numbers on each gun manufactured in Canada. This time, they delayed it until December 2015, conveniently after the next scheduled election date. Now, the connection to the gun lobby is not so clear on this regulation, but I have no doubt that that connection exists. Why else would the Conservatives have appointed a representative of the Shooting Sports Association as a member of the Canadian delegation at international arms treaty negotiations?
What?
That's right. You've heard me correctly. A representative of the Sports Shooting Association and a member of the Firearms Advisory Committee became part of the international delegation to debate the Small Arms Trade Treaty internationally.
Wow.
Now, at a time when 50 other nations have signed the Arms Trade Treaty, why has Canada failed to do so? And why are we excluding ourselves from the important discussions about how to end the illegal arms trade? And the minister, in his speech, made reference to the important role in public safety of stopping smuggling of illegal arms into Canada, yet we've excluded ourselves from the very process that would make that possible.
Quite something.
When it comes to Bill C-42, I guess we should be glad the government abandoned the most extreme recommendations of its Firearm Advisory Committee, those I mentioned a minute ago of 10-year licenses and resale of seized weapons. But now we're seeing complaints in the media from the gun lobby that C-42 doesn't go far enough. And so that's why I'm a little worried about the private members bill that was placed on notice today that we will see later this week and how that relates. And the minister can say all he likes that that's a private members bill and nothing to do with him. Well, we'll see. We'll see if it's nothing to do with this bill, but I guess I have to say when I've seen the gun lobbying saying C-42 should have gone farther, I'm very concerned about the contents of this new private members bill. So now, let me turn to the contents of the bill we have in front of us. One which is still clearly a child of the gun lobby. I should point out, as I did in my question to the minister, there's no evidence of broad consultations throughout the community. And if this is such common sense legislation, I don't understand why such a narrow group of people were the only ones consulted on this bill. So for me, despite the short title, there's nothing common sense about the two major provisions in this bill. One of those makes the gun classification process a clearly political process, and the other removes the requirement for having a permit allowing transportation of firearms present in any vehicle carrying them. Neither of these provisions has any public safety purpose, and instead they respond only to the explicit complaints from the gun lobby. All the other things the Conservatives want to address in this bill could be accomplished without these two provisions. So let me discuss the first change that's proposed in the way weapons are classified. Right now, recommendations on classification are under definitions contained in law, and those recommendations are made by firearms